Hey everybody, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And do you remember in Lion King when Mufasa and Simba are sitting up on that ridge looking over the kingdom after Simba got in trouble? Mufasa's giving them a little talking to about what it is to be king. Mufasa says something like, all of this land out here, like this is our kingdom, but one day the sun is going to set on my time as king and rise on your time as king. And then all of this, everything the light touches, it's going to be yours. Now, when you watched that, I promise you, whether you saw it as an adult or a kid for the first time, you got what was being said, because the most natural way to understand Mufasa's words are, I'm gonna die, then you're going to have to become king, and you will be king over everything the light touches. That will be your responsibility. Nobody in 1994, I think that's when it came out, or since, would watch that and be like, no, I think the most natural read is that the sun is going to rise on some future generation, and Simba isn't really in view here. Mufasa was saying this for the benefit of somebody who would later hear secondhand what Mufasa was saying to Simba, and then they would need to interpret that in light of modern religious sensibilities and modern social, political, theological circumstances to understand that what he meant by saying, you will be king over everything the light touches, was really somebody else far, far, far down the road from now will be king. It's just an unnatural read. And sometimes when we work through, especially prophecy, but some of the more cryptic stuff in the Bible, the temptation can be to latch on to the most unnatural read to make things fit together in a way that feels good with our presuppositions, or maybe even how we've read a couple of the other more difficult and cryptic parts of the Bible, because we all crave harmony. We all want things to work. But in keeping with the wisdom of the last of the great medieval scholastics, William of Ockham, there's something to be said for the simplest interpretation. The most obvious read on a passage oftentimes is likely to be the best read on a passage. And so when we look at this little bit here in Matthew 24, verses 32 to 34, there's been a lot of hand-wringing about a couple of phrases here, and a lot of unnatural reads applied to it. But I think as we look at it together, we have to first at least start with the most natural read as to what Jesus is saying. So let's look at this passage and try to figure out what the most natural read is. And then we'll think about some of the other competing interpretations of this passage. And well, then it'll be up to, I guess, all of you, because it's the internet, to think about whatever makes the most sense in your brain as you wrestle with it. All right, Matthew 24:32. This is Jesus talking. He says, now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. All right, looks like this breaks down into 3 parts. We worked on part 1 yesterday. That's just the business about the fig tree. It's pretty easy. What he seems to be saying here is, hey, guys, I understand that was a lot. It's probably pretty overwhelming, but look, you guys got this. The same way you can look at stuff turning green in the spring and be like, I might not be able to tell exactly what day it is on the calendar from those leaves popping out, but I can give you a pretty good sense of where we are and a pretty good sense of what things are going to look like over the coming weeks. We're right at the threshold of a seasonal change. In the same way, you disciples, because that's who Jesus is talking to here, in the same way you can get that right, and the signs are pretty obvious, so you're going to be able to get this thing right that you're asking about as well. You should have a pretty good sense of what the stuff is that points toward the coming of the Son of Man, the return of Jesus as it was going to be. So that's part 1. We looked at that yesterday. Part 2 is the tricky part that I'm setting up right now. Part 3, just real quick, it's not tough. This is just Jesus making another claim to authority. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Well, that's reminiscent of language in Matthew chapter 5 and the Sermon on the Mount. You'll recall they get done with the Sermon on the Mount. Everybody's like, dang, that guy, he's not like our religious leaders. He is speaking with an authority we've never heard before. Like he owns all of this. Like his interpretation of the law and the prophets and the Old Testament. Like that is not an opinion. That is what it actually means. He is the fulfillment of all of this stuff. He is the completion of the law. And, well, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus offers the assurance that none of that's going to pass away. He's the completion of it. He has authority over it and to interpret it and to be not just the thinker who carries the ideas forward, but he is the essence of what all of that Old Testament, all of the scriptures to date were pointing toward. It's all fulfilled and completed in him. And so it seems like part 3 of this little bit that we're looking at today is just Jesus reaffirming, like, hey, I have the authority to say these things. I'm sovereign over history. I'm sovereign over interpretation of my book. And you, my disciples, should not be discouraged. All of the things that I said are going to happen. They're going to happen. But that leaves us with this tricky little in-between part, which has 2 pivotal phrases. Pivotal phrase number 1, you heard me emphasizing it as I was reading it, is these things. Well, what are these things? What we do with the passage hinges on what we do with that. And then the second little phrase is this generation. Well, what do we mean by this generation? Those are the 2 pivot points. But let's just start with the most natural read on these things. Well, if you're hanging out with somebody at Applebee's and you got a bunch of food and different items on the table in front of you, and you're having an esoteric conversation about the fleeting nature of life and how quick stuff comes and goes, and is the soul eternal, and somebody gestures at everything on the table, and like these things, they just don't matter. They don't last. Well, what are they talking about? Well, they're talking about the things that are physically in front of you on the table, the phone, the keys, the 6 empty, gigantic mega margaritas that are completely drained, the volcano sludge, blondie, brownie ice cream. I don't know what they make at Applebee's, but it's something like that. They're pointing to just everything there, and they're kind of extrapolating it out to just mean stuff in general. That's what these things are in reference to there. But certainly in this hypothetical conversation, the natural read on what this person is saying at Applebee's would not be that these things means like the soul or eternity or the cosmos or the things of God and philosophy. No. Those things are separate. These things contextually is clearly talking about physical stuff in that hypothetical conversation. Likewise, here, these things is clearly in reference to the rest of what we've seen in Matthew chapter 24. These things are the events, the stuff that points toward the return of the Son of Man. That's what the disciples asked about in the first place. That's what Jesus has spent the first part of 24 talking about. But these things would not in this context include the actual return of the Son of Man. That's separate. We're talking about the things that point to the return of the Son of Man. Otherwise, if we interpret these things to mean all the stuff that points to the return of the Son of Man and the return of the Son of Man, then Jesus would be basically saying, like, the way you will know that the Son of Man is about to return is that the Son of Man will return. Like, well, wait, what? No, we're talking about signs. We're talking about things leading up to it, and the disciples wanting to know how they can have a sense of what the timeline is and that they are getting close. So these things, just logically, the most natural read on this has to be the signs, the stuff that points toward the return of the Son of Man, not the actual return of the Son of Man. And further, I don't think these things is referring to the return of the Son of Man because, look, the first half with the little parable, all right, you go out, you look at the fig tree, the twigs get tender, stuff's getting green. And even so, when you see all these things, those being the way the plants are behaving, you know that it is near, right at the door. So the analogy with the phrase, these things, starts with Jesus picking something from the natural world. I mean, like, look at the signs. The signs tell you that the awaited thing is just around the corner, but these things, in that analogy of the fig tree, it's only referring to the signs that point to it, not the actual event. And then in verse 34, the very next sentence, he uses the exact same phrase, these things. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So in the larger context, these things are most naturally understood as the signs that point toward the return of the Son of Man. And in the more narrow context, coming right off of this micro parable, these things are most naturally understood as signs that point toward the return of the Son of Man. These things lead up. The return of the Son of Man is the event that these things anticipate. It is very important for the purposes of understanding this passage that we understand that distinction. So then tomorrow, and it's going to have to be tomorrow because, time, when we look at the second pivotal phrase here, this generation, we have to understand that this generation seeing these things refers not necessarily to the return of the Son of Man, but necessarily to the things that lead up to the return of the Son of Man. That would seem to be what Jesus is saying, what Jesus is promising here with all kinds of authority, as we discussed. We'll continue thinking about what the most natural read on this sometimes controversial passage is as we look at the phrase, this generation, tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.